On June 17, 2026, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan stood before cameras and stated, and I am quoting directly from the official White House transcript, that the United States has communicated to Iran a clear and unambiguous red line. Any direct attack on American personnel or American allies will be met with a swift and decisive response. Clear, unambiguous, swift, decisive. Those 4 words appeared in the official statement. Hold on to them, because in the 96 hours following that statement, according to reporting confirmed by both Reuters and the Associated Press, Iranian-aligned forces in Iraq conducted 3 coordinated strikes on logistics infrastructure directly servicing American military operations in the region. A fuel storage facility was destroyed. A communications relay station was disabled. A vehicle maintenance depot used by American contractors was rendered inoperable. No American personnel were killed. No facility carrying the formal legal status of an American military installation was struck, and the White House issued no response, not a statement, not a briefing update, not a clarification. Silence. These 2 things cannot occupy the same strategic universe with the same meaning. Either the red line is a genuine deterrent mechanism with a genuine enforcement commitment, or Iran identified the precise gap between what the red line says and what the red line means within 96 hours of its public articulation and drove an operational campaign through that gap with 3 coordinated strikes. Today I'm going to show you why the gap was not discovered by Iran through brilliant adversarial analysis. It was built into the red line's architecture before the sentence was finished being spoken. Right now, every foreign policy analyst on CNN, Fox, the BBC, and every major think tank commentary platform is engaged in the same debate, whether America should respond more forcefully to Iranian provocations or whether the red line drew the deterrence boundary in the right place. Bamat stands chins and that. That is the wrong debate. Both sides of that debate share the same foundational assumption, that the red line was a coherent and functional deterrent instrument that either succeeded or failed for reasons of political will, credibility, or strategic commitment. Both sides treat the problem as one of execution. Neither side is asking whether the instrument itself was structurally flawed before any question of execution arose. The right question is this: was the fatal miscalculation inside America's red line strategy not a question of will or credibility, but a question of logic, specifically the internal logical contradiction that any publicly stated, precisely defined military threshold contains, and did Iran identify that internal contradiction before the statement was even made? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to teach you the framework I call the red line paradox, trace its intellectual roots in the foundational strategic theory literature to show that this is not a novel problem, but a documented and understood one. Walk you through 5 specific and observable steps by which Iran systematically reverse engineered and exploited the paradox after Sullivan's statement. Explain why the precedent that has now been established through the non-response cannot be reversed by any subsequent clarification statement, and identify the strategic actor watching all of this with the most focused and consequential attention. The red line paradox begins with a principle that has been understood in strategic theory since the 1960s, but that seems to require rediscovery by each generation of policymakers who must apply it in an active conflict. Thomas Schelling, writing in The Strategy of Conflict in 1960 and Arms and Influence in 1966, articulated the foundational observation with precision. A threat is only as credible as the cost to the threatener of carrying it out. A threat that is cheap to enforce is a credible deterrent because the threatener has no rational reason not to follow through. A threat that is expensive to enforce is a gamble because the threatener must now weigh the cost of enforcement against the cost of non-enforcement. And a threat that has been drawn in a location where enforcement would cost more than non-enforcement is not a deterrent at all. It is an invitation. It tells the adversary the precise threshold of inaction, and all the adversary must do to operate with impunity is remain just below that threshold. Think about a highway speed enforcement system where the automated camera activates only at speeds of 90 miles per hour or above. If you drive at 89 miles per hour, you are not complying with the speed limit because you have made a moral decision to follow the law. You are driving at 89 miles per hour because you have determined that 89 is the maximum speed at which the enforcement system cannot reach you. The speed limit has not deterred you from driving dangerously. It has informed you precisely of your operational ceiling. And once you know your operational ceiling with specificity and confidence, You operate just below it, permanently, continuously, indefinitely, extracting the maximum possible benefit from the gap between the official limit and the enforcement threshold. The enforcement system does not stop you. It defines the space in which you are safe. The historical anchor for the red line paradox is the United States experience in Korea between 1951 and 1953, specifically the armistice negotiation period. During the armistice negotiations at Panmunjom, American commanders repeatedly communicated through diplomatic channels and through operational behavior that specific categories of Chinese military action, if continued or escalated, would trigger escalatory responses from American forces. The problem, documented in the memoirs of General Matthew Ridgway and in subsequent historical scholarship on the armistice period, was that the Chinese People's Volunteer Army systematically identified the operational boundary between what America would tolerate without military response and what it would respond to with force, and then conducted all of its significant military activity inside that boundary. The armistice talks lasted from July 1951 to July 1953. During those 24 months of active diplomacy, Chinese forces used the protected environment of the negotiating process to consolidate defensive positions, resupply forward units, construct infrastructure, and improve the strategic disposition of their forces, all of it below the threshold that would have triggered a full American military response. The American red lines during the armistice period did not stop Chinese military improvement. They defined the space in which Chinese military improvement was operationally safe from American response. Iran has read that history, not as academic curiosity, as operational guidance. Now the evidence. There are 5 specific, sequential, and observable steps in Iran's reverse engineering and exploitation of the red line paradox following Sullivan's June 17th statement. 5 steps, not 1 or 2 provocations. 5 deliberate and sequential steps, each building on the one before it. Step 1, the definitional parsing. Sullivan's statement specified 2 precise conditions for an American response: a direct attack on American personnel or a direct attack on American allies. Every definition in a public policy statement contains, by logical necessity, an exclusion. What a definition includes by name is protected. What a definition does not include by name is excluded from protection. Iran identified the exclusions within the definition within hours of the statement's public release. What is excluded from direct attack on American personnel? An indirect attack. An attack on infrastructure that supports American personnel rather than on the personnel themselves. What is excluded from direct attack on American allies? An attack on facilities serving Allied interests that does not strike formally Allied property directly. The 3 strikes that followed over the next 96 hours targeted logistics infrastructure, not American personnel, not formally Allied installations. Logistics infrastructure servicing American operations, but not carrying the precise legal or definitional status that the red line's language protected. Iran did not cross the red line. It identified the white space the red line's definition created and moved into that white space with 3 coordinated operational strikes. The advanced preparation for identifying which specific targets fell inside that white space took, according to the Iraqi Security Service timeline, subsequently cited by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, approximately 64 hours. 64 hours of target analysis and legal definitional mapping before the first strike was executed. Step 2, the visibility calibration. This element receives almost no analytical attention, and it may be the most strategically sophisticated component of the entire operation. The 3 strikes were calibrated not only to remain inside the definitional exclusion zone of the red line's language, but also to remain below the public visibility threshold that would have created domestic political pressure for an American response, regardless of whether the technical definitional criteria had been met. A strike that kills American personnel generates immediate and intense domestic media coverage, creates public political pressure on the administration to respond, and makes non-response politically untenable even if the red line's precise definitional conditions were not technically satisfied. A strike that disables a logistics fuel depot at 2 in the morning in a remote province generates specialist coverage in defense publications, minimal mainstream media attention, no American casualties, and therefore no political pressure that would force a response over the administration's preference for managing the situation quietly. Iran calibrated not just the legal definition of the targets, but the media salience of the targets. It identified the operational space that is simultaneously inside the definitional exclusion zone and below the visibility threshold that triggers political pressure for response. That double calibration is not the product of intuition. It is the product of systematic study of how American domestic political dynamics interact with military decision-making at the executive level. Step 3. The precedent establishment. This is the most strategically consequential step in the entire sequence, and it happened at the precise moment the White House issued no statement in response to the 3 strikes. In strategic theory and in international relations, precedent functions as revealed information. It tells an adversary not what you have said you will do, but what you have actually done when confronted with a specific situation. The first time an adversary acts inside the white space of your stated red line and you do not respond, you have established 3 things simultaneously. You have confirmed that your red line has a gap. You have revealed that the specific type of action that occurred is in the tolerated space. And you have validated for the adversary that operating in that space is safe because you just declined to contest it when you had the option to do so. The administration may have calculated, reasonably and defensibly, that the 3 strikes did not technically satisfy the red line's definitional criteria and therefore did not require a formal military response. But Iran did not make the same assessment of what had occurred. Iran recorded the non-response, updated its operational map of American decision-making thresholds, and added the confirmed data point. Logistics infrastructure serving American operations is in the safe operating space. The operational ceiling moved. Step 4. The boundary expansion through precedent accumulation. This step is still in its early phase, but its logical structure is already fully visible in the operational pattern. Once non-response to below-threshold strikes has been established as precedent, the adversary's next operation does not need to remain at the identical level of the precedent-establishing action. It needs to remain below the threshold as revealed by the non-response, which is now higher than the threshold implied by the original statement. If the administration did not respond to a strike on a fuel depot, the threshold for response has been implicitly revealed to lie above the operational impact level of a fuel depot strike. The next operation can be designed at a somewhat higher level of operational impact, somewhat more consequential, somewhat more strategically significant, and still remain within the space the administration has revealed through its behavior that it will not contest. This is not escalation in the traditional sense of a dramatic and deliberate step upward. This is boundary expansion through the gradual accumulation of individually small but cumulatively significant precedents. Each non-response slightly expands the operational space the adversary can safely occupy. Over a sustained period, the effective red line migrates without anyone publicly drawing a new one. It migrates because the accumulated precedents of what has been tolerated define it more accurately than the original public statement does. Okay? Does that make sense? The stated red line is where the administration said it would respond. The actual effective red line is where the accumulated precedents of non-response have revealed it will respond. The gap between those 2 lines is Iran's operational territory. Step 5. The internal logical contradiction revealed. The deepest and most consequential flaw in the red line strategy is this. The stated purpose of the red line was to prevent escalation by communicating clearly and publicly the threshold above which American military response was guaranteed. That purpose required specificity. A vague red line might be crossed accidentally by an adversary who genuinely did not understand where the threshold was. Specificity prevents that accidental crossing by communicating the threshold with clarity. But here is the paradox embedded in that logic. A precisely and publicly stated threshold does 2 things simultaneously that are in fundamental tension with each other. It tells the adversary clearly where the threshold is, which prevents accidental crossing above it. And it also tells the adversary precisely where the white space below the threshold is, which enables deliberate, sustained, and systematic operation in that white space. The clearer and more specific the red line, the more accurately it maps both the threshold above which action is deterred and the territory below which action is permitted. Specificity solves the accidental crossing problem while simultaneously creating and defining the white space exploitation problem. A precisely drawn red line in a complex operational environment is not merely a deterrent boundary, it is also a map of the space in which the adversary can operate indefinitely without triggering the deterrent. Sullivan's statement was specific, it was clear, it was precisely phrased, and in that precision, it performed both functions simultaneously. It deterred the actions it named, and it defined the space surrounding those actions as operationally accessible. Now I want to give you the strongest, honest counter-argument, because this argument has genuine force and serious strategic analysts make it. The counter-argument runs as follows. Red lines in active conflict environments are not designed to be logically hermetic constructs that leave no operational space for the adversary. They are designed to communicate political will on the specific issue where political will is most important, which in this case is the protection of American lives. Minor below-threshold provocations are an expected and accepted cost of a deterrence strategy whose primary purpose is preventing a direct attack on American military personnel, which is the escalation scenario that would most directly threaten to drag the United States into a broader war. Responding to every below-threshold incident would require a level of continuous military activity that would itself be escalatory and would consume political capital and military resources that the administration needs to preserve for the genuine threshold crossing events. Red lines in asymmetric conflict environments are not meant to create perfect cordons. They are meant to establish clear priority protection zones with an implicit acceptance that the space around those zones will involve a tolerable level of adversarial activity. That is the deliberate design, not a flaw. This is how experienced strategic planners actually think about threshold management in active asymmetric conflicts. But here's what the counter-argument cannot explain. It cannot explain why the definitional structure of Sullivan's statement was constructed in a way that created a large and operationally exploitable gap rather than a behavioral boundary that would have been significantly harder to map and exploit. A behavioral formulation, such as any action that materially degrades American operational capability in the region will be met with a proportional response, would have been significantly more difficult to definitively map into specific targetable categories. The definitional formulation that was used, direct attack on American personnel or allies, is precisely the formulation that creates the clearest and most exploitable white space around it. That specific formulation was chosen, and it had predictable consequences. It cannot explain why the non-response to 3 coordinated strikes that occurred within 96 hours of the red line's articulation was not accompanied by any clarifying statement redefining what the red line's enforcement scope actually covered. When a deterrent has been tested and the test reveals an ambiguity, clarifying the ambiguity is the standard deterrence management response. The absence of any clarification is not confidence. It is the absence of a clarification the administration does not know how to make without either expanding the red line to a scope it cannot enforce or acknowledging the gap it has already revealed. Let me bring this all together. The red line paradox reveals that the fatal miscalculation embedded in America's red line strategy was not a miscalculation of Iranian intentions, of American credibility, or of the administration's political will. It was a structural logical error built into the instrument before it was deployed. The strategy treated a publicly stated, precisely defined threshold as a deterrent mechanism when its most immediate operational function was informational. It communicated to Iran the precise coordinates of the operational space in which Iranian action was guaranteed not to produce an American military response. Iran used those coordinates with discipline and operational specificity within 96 hours. The 5-step sequence of definitional parsing, visibility calibration, precedent establishment, boundary expansion, and internal contradiction revelation is now complete. The stated red line still exists as a public statement. The effective operational red line has already moved to a location that the public statement does not describe and cannot recover without an enforcement action that the precedents of the last 96 hours have made significantly more politically difficult to execute. The question is not whether the strategy failed. The question is whether anyone inside the decision chain has correctly diagnosed why. And here's the actor that nobody in this conversation is analyzing. Not Iran, not the United States, China. China is studying the red line paradox's execution in the Persian Gulf with one very specific analytical focus: the formulation that the United States will use when articulating its red line on Taiwan. Because Taiwan is the red line conversation that is coming, and its stakes are an order of magnitude higher. The United States has made increasingly specific public statements over the past several years about its commitment to Taiwan's defense and about the categories of Chinese action that would trigger a military response. Each additional increment of specificity in those statements makes them more credible as expressions of political will and more exploitable as definitional maps that a sophisticated adversary can use to identify the operational space around the protected categories. If China watches Iran successfully execute the 5-step red line paradox exploitation sequence in the Persian Gulf, it will apply the identical analytical methodology to every American public statement about Taiwan. It will identify the definitional exclusions. It will calibrate operational actions to remain below the visibility threshold that creates domestic political pressure for American response. It will accumulate precedents of tolerated activity. And it will do this in a theater where the cost of American enforcement is not merely politically complex and diplomatically challenging, but potentially existential in its global systemic consequences. The patient giant is not studying this red line because it supports Iran's strategic goals. It is studying it because it is conducting research on American threshold architecture, and Taiwan is the thesis. 3 things to watch in the next 48 to 72 hours. First, watch for any shift in the formulation used by administration officials when they discuss the red line in subsequent public statements. If the language migrates from the specific definitional formulation of direct attack on American personnel to any behavioral formulation that refers to operational capability, degradation, or mission effectiveness, that linguistic shift is a policy change.